Good morning, everybody. Before we talk about the homeless and their voting challenges, let's talk for a minute about homelessness, how it happens, what we could do about it if we wanted to solve it. What if I told you we could end homelessness if we really wanted to do it? What if I said you've been lied to, that we're not overcrowded or under-resourced? In truth, you're on planet Earth. We have enough. Yes, homeless people fall into this circumstance in a myriad of different ways. It is true that some, although certainly not most, homeless people are battling an addiction or physical or mental health disability. However, it is also true that most homeless people wound up this way due to a lack of affordable housing. But here's the kicker. There is a common denominator amongst all the homeless. There is one thing that 100% of homeless people need to end their homelessness. In case you haven't guessed, that one thing is a home. Do we have enough of them? Yes, we do. The White House reports that as of 2019, over 500,000 Americans don't have a home to sleep in on any given night, while almost 17 million potential homes and apartments were standing empty, vacant. We choose to let those residences remain vacant. So on the one hand, we have homelessness, a growing problem that has unleashed itself as a full-blown crisis. On the other hand, we have plenty of vacant housing units. The adverse effects of homelessness are endless and certainly not confined only to the homeless individuals. Homelessness places economic hardship on whole communities. Numerous studies have shown it costs communities more to tolerate homelessness than to provide affordable housing. Homelessness causes a community to be less wealthy, less healthy, less safe from crime, and a less attractive place to live for all residing or working in. So how can we reduce homelessness? Actually, the solutions are not all that complicated, even if they often prove difficult to implement. The chief barriers to ending homelessness are political and not economic. Studies show that homelessness rises dramatically when the cost of housing exceeds 1/3 of median family income. So the best solution to homelessness is a combination of more affordable housing and a fair living minimum hourly wage. We can and should do what is required to provide adequate physical and mental health care to low-income and low-wealth families and individuals, and the disabled, as well as treatment for those with addictions. Employment training and job placement services are also essential. These services help to transition people from homelessness to becoming productive members of a sustainable community. The next time you see a public space brimming with tents and harboring homeless people's belongings, look inward. I urge you to think about this and what we can do about ending homelessness. Give some thought to support for our local Comal County Coalition for the Homeless. Also, contact our legislators for what is needed to end homelessness and create healthier and safer communities that benefit us all. So let's talk a little bit about the challenges of the homeless to vote and access the ballot. The cornerstone of our democracy in America is the right to vote. Can someone who is homeless register and vote? Yes, persons experiencing homelessness can register and vote in all 50 states. Yet low-income voters, and particularly persons experiencing homelessness, are consistently one of the most poorly represented blocks when it comes to voter turnout. Statistics show that only 1 in 10 of the homeless can conquer the barriers to the ballot to cast a vote in federal elections. This situation is in part a legacy of the country's original requirement at our country's founding that to be eligible to vote, a person had to be a white male landowner. That rule has changed over the years to include women, people of color, renters, and people with mortgages. But the idea remains in most states that a person must have a residence, a mailing address, a sustained presence in a particular community to be allowed to vote. The 2002 Help America Vote Act reinforced that concept. Under that legislation, many states now ask would-be voters for a mailing address, proof of rent, home ownership, utility service at an address, or evidence of having lived in the community for a specified period of time. Unfortunately, people who are homeless have trouble meeting these demands. There are ways to help the homeless address these requirements, but many experiencing homelessness are unaware of these alternatives and have no one to help them to overcome those challenges. Many homeless and low-income voters may not have the appropriate identification documents required by some states to register or to vote. Furthermore, individuals experiencing homelessness may lack the resources to educate themselves about candidates or may not be able to get to the polls on election day. Finally, many individuals, homeless or otherwise, aren't even aware that no state requires residents to have a traditional residence to vote in an election. What can we do to help provide those experiencing homelessness a voice in our electoral process? And who is working on that challenge? If voting is the cornerstone of American democracy, why does it have to be such a pain? Election day in the US is always a Tuesday, smack in the middle of the work week. If you move to a new state or county, you need to re-register. State voter ID requirements change all the time. So you could show up to a polling station, wait in line, and still get blocked from voting. Polling stations are frequently relocated, often not conveniently or accessible by public transportation. Lack of convenient local access makes it particularly difficult for those who or have difficulty with personal transportation, often the poor, elderly, and the disabled. Hours at polling stations are usually limited to times not always convenient for the working poor, shift workers, and those working late hours. Long lines and wait times make voting challenging for single parents who may require childcare for young children in order to spend time voting. Now imagine that you're homeless in America. Your homelessness and poverty now compound all of those challenges. You may move so frequently that it's nearly impossible to maintain a stable mailing address. You've never had a driver's license, or the license in your Social Security card were lost or stolen years ago. You can't afford transportation to the local county elections office, a location where state-issued photo ID cards are made available, or your local polling place. And frankly, you have a lot more pressing problems than registering to vote. Unfortunately, candidates campaigning for office take little interest in your challenges. Frequently, candidates do not speak to issues you face daily, including poverty, affordable and available housing, mental health, or social services. So while homeless people have every right to vote in US elections and may want to, if only to influence policy on housing and poverty, the obstacles to successfully registering and voting while homeless can be insurmountable. First, there's the residence and mailing address issue. Interestingly, none of the 50 states requires that voters live in a traditional residence. On voter registration forms, you can put a homeless shelter address or a church's address. That's fine for establishing you're a resident of the state and county, but many states also require that you provide a mailing address where you can receive mail. Again, that can be a shelter or a friend or relative's house, but it can't be a post office box, and it can't be a park bench or a homeless encampment. While it's easy for most Americans to provide an alternative address where we could receive mail, that's often not the case for people struggling with homelessness. And without a fixed address to receive election notices from the county clerk's office, homeless voters can easily be wiped from voter registration rolls and often are. It's important to remember that homelessness is an inherently unstable condition. Homelessness is made even more unstable by local laws that criminalize sleeping or camping in public places. Looking at you, Texas, and our Republican governor and legislature. Those laws have the effect of displacing people from the areas where they usually live and have connections. The lack of an address and the lack of ability to stay in one location lawfully conspire to make it even more difficult for homeless people to register or vote by mail. Lack of identification is another big challenge for homeless voters. As of 2021, there are 11 states with, quote, strict photo ID or non-photo ID laws, meaning that you cannot vote on election day without presenting some kind of valid government-issued identification. Another 24 states have non-strict voter ID laws that allow voters without an ID to sign an affidavit swearing to their identity. Unfortunately, increasingly, a more significant number of states are passing more challenging voter ID requirements and making the existing requirements more difficult for the poor, homeless, elderly, students, and the disabled. Even in states without voter ID laws, voters registering must provide a driver's license number or copies of that utility bill, bank statement, or other documents certifying their residency. All of these are challenging documentation requirements if you are homeless or impoverished. While obtaining a driver's license or state issue ID is reasonably accessible in most states, that doesn't mean it's easy for a homeless person to jump through the administrative hoops to make it happen. The poor, elderly, disabled, and homeless people are far more likely to have a state-issued ID. Voter ID laws have been challenged as discriminatory in many courts based on the difficulties obtaining proper identification documents, but they continue to remain a challenge for many, particularly the populations mentioned, including the homeless. Then there's the issue of safeguarding your personal property if you're homeless. Even if a homeless person is lucky enough to possess an acceptable ID, there are many ways for those documents to get lost or stolen, even at the hands of the police. Local governments often respond to illegal homeless encampments by coming in and doing a cleanup that results in the seizure and destruction of a homeless person's property. You could potentially lose your ID or your birth certificate or social security card or any of the other prerequisite items that you need to register during one of these cleanups. The good news is that homeless advocacy groups like the National Coalition for the Homeless have created resources like its Homeless Voting Rights Guide to help homeless shelters, drop-in centers, food pantries, and other nonprofit groups organize voter registration drives to help homeless individuals register and get to the polls. Despite the daunting bureaucratic hurdles facing homeless voters, there are a handful of states that specifically offer exemptions for homeless citizens, a trend that hopefully continues. Both Oregon and Indiana are states that present such opportunities. Texas, however, is not one of those states. I'd like to share with you a story from the March issue of 2020 on the difficulties of the homeless voting. This was in Texas Monthly. On Monday night before he went to sleep between two food trucks in downtown Austin, Garland Green had a plan to tuck his voter registration certificate inside his wallet which he then chained to his waist. Green wanted to vote for the first time in the Texas primary election on Tuesday, and he was not taking any chances. Over the years, he had lost essential documents or had them stolen countless times. And because of Texas's strict voter ID law, he won't be able to cast a ballot without the certificate. He plans on voting for Bernie Sanders, whose Medicare for All and student debt forgiveness policies he's discussed with friends on the street. Otherwise, he said, I'm not really too interested in politics. Given recent changes to the state's stringent voter ID law, Green should be able to vote on Tuesday with his registration card and a signed affidavit swearing he can't easily get an ID. In 2016, after courts repeatedly found Texas state's voter laws discriminate against minorities, a Texas federal court ordered the state to adopt an interim system. In 2017, the legislature passed a revised voter ID law, allowing those without valid identification to vote, provided they present supporting, easier to obtain documentation, like Green's registration certificate, and sign an affidavit under penalty of perjury saying they possess a, quote, reasonable impediment to obtain a valid ID. Despite the tweaks in 2017, voting is still a challenge for many in Texas, especially for the more than 30,000 Texans experiencing homelessness. Not only do they face the difficulties of life on the streets, but they also must overcome obstacles imposed by the state, including burdens on obtaining that ID, a lack of readily accessible voter information, and a voter challenge system that puts those who are homeless at particular risk of being taken off the voter rolls. Texas official voter website boasts, voting is easy, so is getting the facts. Interviews with dozens of prospective homeless voters, though, the week before the 2020 election shows that neither of those breezy claims is exactly valid. It's clear the state's voter ID laws, passed despite a lack of evidence of voter fraud, are making it harder for many who do want to engage in the election. And all of this is before the latest suppression legislation passed on party line votes by Republicans in Texas. To vote, an already registered voter's first option is to obtain one of the 7 valid IDs established by the legislature. Photo identification from a shelter won't suffice, but a gun license will. For some, mainly those in shelters, obtaining a valid ID may be accomplished with the shelter's help and expenses frequently paid by charities. But for those living on the streets, the process can be time-consuming and prohibitively expensive, even with the help of nonprofits. Another potential obstacle, unlike the court-ordered affidavit, which allows voters to describe their reasonable impediment in their own words, the 2017 law provides a checklist of only 7 potential reasons. Poverty, or I live on the streets and have no access to the internet to figure out what I needed to bring, are not listed as valid excuses. And it's not easy to fill out the form correctly. Problems can also arise before a homeless person even gets to the polls. For example, Texas law provides that any voter can challenge the registration based on personal knowledge that the qualifications for voting haven't been met. Because homeless people frequently register from non-residential addresses, like churches or shelters, where they can receive mail, they are especially susceptible to challenges. If they don't respond to mail asking them to confirm their address, their registrations can be suspended and canceled. This means that many homeless people who live far from where they may receive mail can have their voting rights stripped without their knowledge. In 2018, Houston conservative activist Alan Vera, who is connected to the controversial vote monitoring organization True the Vote, challenged the registration of more than 4,000 voters, many of whom a Houston press investigation found had registered from homeless shelters. The Harris County Attorney's Office dismissed the challenges, pointing out that it was practically impossible for Vera to possess personal knowledge of thousands of voter registration issues. But voter challenges can intimidate prospective voters from even bothering to vote. Add up all the obstacles, and it's clear that the system is not built in a way to make it easy for those experiencing homelessness to vote. Even the slightest impediment to those experiencing homelessness or poverty is going to be seen as another, nope, you can't vote. In conclusion, I'd like to say it's time for all of us to stand up for every legal citizen's right to vote in free and fair elections. Voting is fundamental to every other constitutional and legal right granted to our citizens and should be easy and accessible for all, regardless of their circumstances. Our Unitarian Universalist principles support this issue, including the first principle, which says the inherent worth and dignity of every person is to be respected. Our second principle on justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. The fifth principle, the right of conscience and the use of democratic process within our own congregations and in society at large. And the sixth principle on the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. All of these principles in Unitarian Universalism encourage us to support voting rights for the homeless. Thanks, everyone.